I've been wanting to work on a project with a bit more of a challenging paint job, and naturally my brain decided that Gungan was the way to go. You're also all probably well aware by now that my choice of project scale tends to be life-size, so today we's going to be making a life-size Jar Jar Binks bust. Before I can get to the painting part, I do actually need to make a Jar Jar to be able to paint, so let's jump into that first. Now, Jar Jar is apparently 1.96 meters tall, but I'm going to be making this bust. So to figure out what the right scale should be for this project, I used my Photoshop trick. This is where I make the image the exact size of the real thing, and then use the line tool to measure a particular distance. According to this, Jar Jar should be about 64 centimeters tall from the cutoff point of this bust, which ends up being a super casual 457% of the original. This is of course now a huge single piece, so we're going to need to split it to fit on my 3D printers. Yes, I do technically have a machine that could have possibly printed this in one piece, but I did not feel like risking this being a single print today, and I also wanted all of these pieces to be printed in ABS, which limits what machines I can use as well, since they need to be enclosed. Here is what I ended up with for the split pieces. Not the prettiest job I've ever done, but it gives me the option to use multiple machines to get this bust printed even faster. I used black ABS for everything. It tends to be the color I keep on hand, and it also does a great job showcasing all of the details on a print. I used a combination of my Bamboo Lab H2S and H2D to get things printed over a couple of days only. And I have to say, both did an incredible job with all of these pieces. There are a lot of really awesome textures that are already part of this model, so seeing it printed at this large scale is very impressive. Next was on to assembling all of these parts, and thankfully because this is ABS, I could just use some acetone to melt the parts together. I tried to go piece by piece before I just had a whole bunch of loose parts that I had to deal with, so I decided to go back to working on the head. A lot of you have probably theorized by now that with all of the textures and wrinkle details and everything, I'm obviously not going to be doing my typical post-processing routine with a whole bunch of sanding. All I'm basically doing is trying to make this not look like a 3D print. So in the case of Jar Jar's head, really the only spots that needed a little bit of work were the upper layers where you could start to see some of those layer lines appear. So I'm applying some of my ABS and acetone slurry mix to those areas to fill in those layer lines and make it look like it has the same texture over the whole part, which is also what I'll be doing for the rest of the body once I have that all assembled. I decided to use dowels this time for the parts split to help line them up, and I pretty immediately regretted that decision. I was fighting with them far more than it was probably worth, so thankfully the base could be printed in one piece, which I cannot tell you how happy I was to not have to deal with putting more of these Jar Jar parts together. And because I had fought so much with those dowels, I didn't feel like I did the best job assembling this together, so we have some pretty nasty seams to now deal with. I started by applying more of my acetone slurry mixture. It was just the safest bet because I knew I could very easily blend that into the rest of the surface and not create any weird harsh lines, since getting rid of these seam lines is way more about masking them into the surrounding texture rather than fully smoothing them out. I couldn't build the slurry up fast enough though, so I then switched over to some Bondo spot putty since I felt like I had a pretty decent amount of control when applying this. The only real way to tell how I was doing in terms of masking the seam line was to spray this entire bust down with some filler primer so that it was a single color and I could see where I needed to do more work, add some texture, all of that fun stuff. And there were definitely some areas that required more improvement. So I then went in with this thick UV resin mixture and applied that to the seam lines because again, it was something that I felt like I had a lot of control with. You know, I could apply it with a variety of brush sizes. I also went over it with a sea sponge to try and blot out the texture and give it more of a skin-like texture depending on which area I was working on. It was actually quite difficult, or more difficult than I was anticipating, because it has been a while since I've done a project like this, and when I have done this sort of thing in the past, I've been adding texture to the entire thing and not trying to blend in the texture with pre-existing existing texture that's already part of the model. But you know, I did want this to be a challenging project for myself, so at the very least this was interesting practice, I guess. After the UV resin, I also flipped back to some thinned out spot putty with acetone because there were some areas around the ears that I just felt like I wasn't going to be able to fit the UV light in, especially on the underneath of the ears and the back of the neck, so I needed something that was going to be able to set on its own. Once I'd felt like I'd built up enough texture to mask all of the seam lines and weird areas, I then absolutely drenched this bust in filler primer. That's the other really nice thing about a model that has so much texture is you'll never be able to see if there's any paint drips, so I really wasn't worried and I really did not want to have to sand any part of this model, so I had the filler primer trying to do all of the work. I also did the same idea for the stand, which I did end up doing a bit of acetone smoothing on as well before this priming step, but it really wasn't that exciting. And once the primer had dried on the base, I removed Jar Jar and then sprayed the entire base with a matte black. This ended up being the final paint job for this base because I didn't want it to distract from Jar Jar. But now onto the fun part of this project, the painting. I wanted to start by doing some base coats to kind of block in the different colors. Jar Jar poses a very interesting painting challenge because he's kind of always changing and there are technically multiple versions of him. You have the real physical suit version that was made that looks one way, and then you have CGI Jar Jar that seems to change from scene to scene and also as technology improved. So I'm just putting it out there now that this paint job was an attempt at an approximation of all of those different versions, and also maybe with a little bit of artistic liberty thrown in as well. So I started off with this lighter cream color and focused that on all of Jar Jar's extremities and front. I then went in with more of a light peach color and basically painted all of the other areas of skin that weren't already covered with that cream, and used this peach shade to kind of blend and create a nice transition between the areas that will become more of that deeper orange color and the ones that will still stay more of that lighter cream. I then kind of repeated that same step, but this time with the darker orange, keeping the color really concentrated in the areas that I knew were going to be that darker orange, and then gradually blending them out on the face and down the ears. And when I say blending, I really just mean that I'm having less paint come out of my airbrush so that the color isn't as intense. Airbrushes are an amazing tool to use when you're painting organic things like this because it gives you a ton of control and layerability with the paint. I still ended up doing a pretty decent amount of brush painting as well, though. I realized that I was just spending forever trying to build up this orange shade in the darker areas, and I also couldn't easily get to a bunch of the areas where I needed to underneath the ears with my airbrush. So I decided to bust out a paintbrush, and this model is so textured that I really wasn't worried about accidentally having any brush strokes be visible. In fact, I was really into the idea of there being alternating textures. If you only use an airbrush, it almost creates too much of a uniform texture, which is also why I then decided to go in with a wash of color to try and deepen up some of the wrinkles and just try to build up some different layers of color and texture, which to me is the key to organic painting. You need it to have a whole bunch of layers like an onion in order for it to look real. So at this point, that's mostly what I was working on, just building up some different layers, tweaking the values of certain areas. The underneath of the ears looked a bit dark, so I went in with a lighter paint, and then I used that same lighter paint on the backs of the ears and stippled that on to create some interesting texture patterning. For this next part, I used a couple of specific tools. This particular airbrush has a separate MAC valve, which essentially means you can control how much of a splattery effect it can create. But even better than that, in my opinion, is this 3D print that you can clip onto any airbrush to get even more of a splatter effect. Seriously, one of the best things I've ever 3D printed. So I started out with the MAC Valve airbrush to apply really lightly this like dark brown purple color, really concentrating that in some of the deeper recessed areas, but also just trying to kind of spray it over the whole area to try and build up like almost age spots across this entire skin. But that was just not doing enough for me in terms of splatter, so that is when I switched over to the 3D printed tool and another airbrush to really up the splatter effect. I did a couple of different colors of splatter. I did that darker purple color and then also like a really bright orange, and used that to blend in and create a bit more texture of the transition between the darker orange and the cream color. I know it very annoyingly does not look like I'm doing anything on camera, but this is what it was looking like up close. The splatter just creates a texture that I love and I think looks fantastic on organic paint jobs, although it does work really well for weathering too. The next step I took was going over those darker orange areas with a wash that was like a dark purple, because that is kind of the other trick to organic looking paint jobs, is try and introduce multiple colors, because if I just used brown or orange for the whole thing, it would just end up looking kind of flat and not very lifelike. I specifically used purple because I was concerned if I went straight in with a blue that the blue and the orange would cancel each other out too much and it would just end up looking black. Because, you know, color theory. So the purple was the way that I was hoping to try and maintain some of that color saturation. Next up was the step that I tried to put off for as long as I possibly could, and that was adding the skin markings to the arms. And I decided to approach this in the most psychotic way possible by freehanding the entire design. Do I recommend attempting this? No. But did it work? Yes. I had obviously considered first drawing on some sort of base plan for these lines, but I realized that it would possibly just be more of a mess because the lines have a decent thickness to them, so I would have basically had to draw myself almost like a maze to try and follow, and that sounded like significantly more of a hassle than what it was worth. And the other thing that I realized that did push me over the edge of why I did decide to freehand them was the arms definitely do not match, or at least from what I can tell, the pattern on both of Jar Jar's arms is not symmetrical. So thankfully I found some reference photos of each arm that were pretty good, so I picked a spot or a line that was a very specific shape that I could constantly find easily, started there and just worked my way outwards from that pattern. Other than fully winging this design on both arms, the other slight artistic liberty that I had to take was it does seem like this pattern does continue up the neck and on the back of the neck, at least in some of the versions of Jar Jar, and I basically just couldn't do it because there was no way I could get my airbrush back there and continue that pattern with the solid ears in the way. So the neck I had to keep as more of a gradient. I did try and hint at there being some of that texture and those lines coming from the back of the neck, but it is a lot smoother than it possibly should be. Next, I wanted to add some more depth and definition into the wrinkles, starting with the ear wrinkles using a brush, since again, airbrush was not going to fit back there, but I did switch to using my airbrush for the back of the ear wrinkles because I just felt that the brush was a little harsh for these areas. The airbrush gives you just such a nice flawless gradient that looks really natural. And for this I was pretty much just tracing the wrinkles and adding more depth and darkness into any of those more recessed areas. And it's okay if it looks kind of zebra-y at this point because now we're going to be pushing all of that back with adding more of that orange color over top. So first I started with the lower portion of the ear because I realized how much of a color difference there was between the upper section and lower section, so I needed to smooth out that transition of color. I also went over the very middle section of the shoulders just to push back that skin texture a little and make it look like it's more part of the skin and not just like a tattoo painted over top. But in general, I kind of just went over the entire ear section and back of the head to blend out some of those darker areas and make them look more like they were part of the skin and not sitting on top of the skin. I also deepened up some parts of the face since I hadn't been brave enough up until this point to fully pull that orange down closer to the nostrils. Things being too light were significantly better than things being too dark and trying to have to fix that. Yeah, the name of the game, as I'm sure you can probably tell, is to build up layers gradually for a really natural effect. I also added a bit of a pinky orange shade around the mouth and lips to again just, bring some life to this Gungan. And that's why I was calling the skin paint job complete, so I decided to move on to working on the clothing. And let me tell you, after that skin painting, this was an absolute breeze. I started off by applying a rough base coat of this dark grayish brown color to all of the clothing, the shirt and also the vest. Once that had dried, I then went over the entire vest with this lighter tan and dry brushed the entire thing so that the paint was really only sticking to the high points of the texture of the vest. Jar Jar's vest and clothing in general look pretty dirty or sandy, so this was kind of killing two birds with one stone because it was making the vest the correct color, but it was also giving that appearance that it could possibly also have some dust attached to the leather or whatever this is supposed to be made out of. I used the same color to very lightly dry brush the undershirt as well, but it is mostly that dark grayish brown color, so I really didn't do too much dry brushing there. And then it was on to the eyes, which are definitely the most condensed, complicated paint job part of this project. I started off with painting a gloss black base over the entire eye area, and that was for two reasons. One, because it doesn't really look like Jar Jar has like whites to his eyes. He has very amphibian-like eyes, and the iris looks like it always takes up the entire part, and I also found a few examples where it did look like his entire eyeball was in fact black other than his golden yellow iris. And the other reason I wanted it to be a glossy black was because I knew I wanted to use metallic paints for the iris. This does go back again to the idea that he does have very amphibian-like eyes, and amphibians have eyeballs that do not look like they really belong to the rest of their body. They're very intense, and the easiest way to do that is to give the eyeballs like a different finish basically. So the metallic paint was my way of achieving this effect. Other than in general, Jar Jar does also look like he has very golden irises anyway, so I used a combination of layering a bunch of different bronze and gold shades to try and build up a really natural looking iris, and then going over directly around where the pupil is with a really bright like champagne gold. Like amphibians, he has a very intense ring of color around his pupil. Once the paint had dried, I finished off the eyeballs by going over them with a couple of layers of gloss varnish. And here is the finished life-size Jar Jar Binks bust. This was definitely a really fun challenge, and I hope you enjoyed seeing the entire process of building him. I'm going to leave you with lots of close-ups of all of his painting details, but thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.